Why play Rebels? Well, you might be starting out the game with some AP items as well as some Sentinel units. You want to play a relatively safe comp that is a little bit less contested than some of the other AP lines. You have high econ or in a high econ galaxy and think that you can fast 9, because this comp is quite reliant on 5 costs in order to quote unquote win out. Or you have a strong array of mixed AP and AD items that you think you can itemize multiple carries. However, this comp, as I mentioned before, is a bit reliant on 5 costs in order to quote-unquote win or get a first. The front line is often very contested, so sometimes even if it's an uncontested line that people aren't playing towards Rebels, most people in the lobby are going to hold on to the main frontline unit for this trait, which is Alawi, which can make it very difficult to play. Itemizations are also sometimes awkward because a lot of the units' best items are the ones that bring out the most potential of a couple of the early game units don't translate super well into late game units. So, before we get much further, please make sure to like and subscribe if you like my content. If you return and watch a couple of my guides and they've helped you out at all, please click the button because it does help me out. 90% of you aren't subscribed and there's a lot of returning viewers, so it does help me out as a small creator. If those people, or if you're one of those people, you can consider to show support by subscribing. So, let's go through the Rebel trait in general. Now, Rebels, when you read it, instantly, Rebels gain 12% max health. Now, this 12% max health is real. It happens as soon as you activate the trait. I've had multiple comments over the course of the past month whenever I post Rebel content that saying that 3 Rebel doesn't give you the max health. I'm not pointing out to anybody in particular. I know there was a recent comment that said this in one of my videos. I'm telling you guys now, you get the 12% max health with 3 Rebel. Additionally, you're going to see more health later, but I just want to point that out there. The first bar, unless it's bugged, which I don't think it is, if you put in 3 Rebel, you get max health on all your Rebel units, which is pretty massive. It's pretty substantial, which we'll talk about later. Additionally, after your team loses 25% of their health, a smoke signal appears, granting Rebels 60% attack speed for 5 seconds and extra power for the rest of combat. So the extra power now comes in the form of this 3, 5, and 7 Rebel. So as well as 10 Rebel, we'll talk about that later as well. So you get stacking AD and AP, so 3, 5, and 7 give you AP AD. 5 Rebel gives you a little bit more HP, gives you an additional 12% max HP, and then 7 Rebel gives you 15% HP, and then it also stuns the enemy for 2 seconds. The 7 Rebel is the main killer of the Rebel trait. You always want to get to 7 Rebel. Playing 3 Rebel, unless you're you're never really playing like Rebel carry, Rebel tank, 3 Rebel. A lot of times you can splash in 3 Rebel if you're playing around Alawi or some of the other Rebel units to just make them a little bit beefier. But typically, when I'm talking about playing vertical Rebel or playing mostly Rebel units and an entire board made of Rebel units, 5 Rebel is kind of eh. 7 Rebel, because of the stun, is massive. A 2-second stun is huge and it warrants playing 7 Rebel. Now, 10 Rebel, you need 2 spatulas for, and you have to make it to level 10. That's a little bit of a stretch goal, but obviously, if you hit 10 Rebel, you're probably winning the game instantly on the spot. That's one of those loot sub, high roll kind of games, so we don't have to worry too much about that. Now, when should you play Rebels? The main carry for Rebel is an AP carry. It is Zoe. That is the 4 cost that you're probably going to try to stabilize around. So a lot of times I recommend playing Rebels when you have a AP opener, similar to like a Jewel Gauntlet. Things like general AD items also can work because you have Ezreal, which is quite strong, that you can position or play around for your mid game. But AD items can also eventually go on Jinx, which is the main win condition for the Rebel trait. Sorry about the thing on the side, my slides were messed up. Secondly, if you have a spatula, a lot of times having a Rebel emblem allows you to cap your board a lot higher, as well as having a Sentinel emblem. If you have a Sentinel emblem and you're unable to play around Heimer Sentinels, Rebels is like the great plan B. It's the great secondary option that you should always leave yourself open to, because most of the other lines, whether you're trying to angle towards Silco Dominators, which is really strong, or you're trying to angle yourself towards Heimer, that's really strong, going towards Rebel, it's obviously going to be a weaker comp. I'm going to say that right now. You might not have the highs of the other comps while playing this comp, but it is a good fallback option. A lot of times, most people will overlook playing around Zoe in lieu of contesting Heimer and contesting Silco. So a lot of times, if you have stuff like an opener with Sentinels, and you think that there's too many people playing Heimer, or if you have the free spot of like playing around a Rebel spatula and like a trainer or an Ambessa encounter, for example, it's quite rewarding, and you can get pretty strong boards, even considering the fact that the trait isn't as like flashy as some of the other ones. Additionally, this trait also has a lot of really good augments. There's augments that you might not consider. There's a lot of augments that are good for AP lines, right? Like mana flow, like anything that kind of seems to help like AP casters is usually good, or anything that kind of buffs your board is really good. There's many augments that actually work really well with rebel trait in particular. The first one that is absolutely insane is paint the town blue. So the first 5 rebels that die each combat summon a copy of themselves. It's insane. It's very strong, and a lot of times it can put you in like a game-winning spot if you can reach those high cap versions of this board. Additionally, there's many generic augments that work really well with rebels. For example, little buddies. Your 4 and 5 cost units gain health and attack speed for every 1 cost and 2 cost champion on your board. That's massive, because you're basically, whenever you're trying to play around 7 rebel, you're playing a bunch of these trash 1 and 2 cost units that are basically doing nothing except giving you that 2-second rebel stun, as well as the bonus stats on all the other units. So little buddies actually makes them worthwhile to play and buffs your board dramatically. This is one of the best boards for little buddies for that reason. Additionally, there's other augments that are really good. There's the ones like, I forget what it's called, but it's like every time an ally of yours dies, pass extra traits onto the other units. Because you're playing 7 rebel, they get stats every time your units die because they all share the rebel trait with each other. That one's really good with rebels. But these 2 are like 2 of the major ones that if you see it, there should be a light bulb saying, oh, you know, maybe instead of contesting one of the more popular comps, I can just play towards rebel here, and I can land myself into a nice 2nd or a 3rd pretty easily because people aren't playing around Zoe. Now, let's go through some late game boards. Before we do that, I just want to talk about the trait in general. So a lot of times when people talk about rebel, obviously like 3 rebel isn't really like playing around rebel. That's just like you splash it in while playing some other thing. Like a lot of times you play 3 rebel with like Heimer boards or things like that. 5 rebel does really bad because 5 rebel is kind of useless. Without the stun, the stats are kind of middling. It does give a bunch of attack speed, but a lot of times you're not trying to play 5 rebel. The stats are also skewed because a lot of times these 5 rebel boards are people that just miss dramatically on hitting the actual units that they need to make it to 7 rebel. So I wouldn't worry too much about this. But if you look at 7 rebel, it's a pretty even spread. Rebel is something that's like, you know, a lot of people play it. It's one of the main hallmark vertical traits of the set 13. So it's one of like the flagship ones. You know, it has Jinx as the carry. Jinx, like the Jinx, you know, the one from Arcane. So like obviously Rebel is going to be like one of the popular ones. You'll see that it's like, you know, it's pretty evenly spread. It's pretty average, right? You have like a 50% top 4 rate. It's not that bad to play towards. It's just not super amazing. It's not super flashy. It's not gonna like win you the game. It's kind of like, hey, do you have a good spot for this? If you have a good spot for it, good augments, good items, you're gonna probably top 4. If you don't have a good spot for it, you're probably gonna bot 4. It's a very average comp. Now, when we look at the comp, there's one thing I wanted to talk about, which was Jinx. Jinx is really important for this comp, but she's like, usually when you play this comp, you're basically trying to fast 9 to play around Jinx. Now, it's not as bad as some other comps though. It's just what I really want to mention. So if you look at Jinx, she doesn't affect the placement super dramatically. I think before we talked about like enforcers, and I was saying it's like Kate Win or Kate or Aethelyn. I made the joke. It's not as much as a problem as some of the other comps, because even without a Jinx, you're relatively stable as long as you have a good spot where you have a Lowy upgraded and Zoe upgraded. Obviously, Jinx is like what's needed for you to get into that potential to first the lobby and just win the game for free. But she's not like that crazy of a skew. I think at higher levels of gameplay, she becomes a lot more important. Like, you know, maybe so, but like it's not essential is what I'll say, and I'll talk about it a little bit more as we go through the boards. So of the units, there are 8 rebel units. In order to hit 10 rebel, you would need 2 spats because there are 8 units. If you look at the rebel units, you basically have an array of low cost and high cost units, and they have a lot of synergies with many different traits. There's a lot of flexible options because of this, but typically, like I said, because of how important the stun is with 7 rebel, as well as how good like the stats and the HP is, a lot of times you usually want to play around 7 rebel because the stun can sway the fight so dramatically that it makes it worthwhile to play 7 rebel. When you're playing 7 rebel, you're basically going to play almost all of these units, so you want to hold on to them if you're considering playing rebel, especially since a lot of them are low cost units. They might not come back. What's really nice is that you have these cool pairings, right? You have somebody like Vex and Zoe, and you have Ezreal with Caitlyn, and also inter-team synergy of Sentinel, so you'll always have a little bit of a front line working for you because the two rebel units, Irelia and Alawi, both have Sentinel as a frontline trait. Additionally, if you have to stabilize around bruisers, you do have an option with Set to play bruiser. But early game, what's really nice is that if you have an AP opener, you can typically play around Zoe. Because like, you know, you put your items on Vex for your mid game, and then by the time you need to switch items off of Vex, you then can play towards Zoe. And also Ezreal is a really good holder of AD items. I usually try to say not to itemize yourself towards a 5 cost because you might never find the 5 cost, and that's true in this case. I wouldn't necessarily play towards Rebel if you have like a full AD opener, something like, you know, IE, Last Whisper, right? I wouldn't necessarily build these items when playing towards Rebel because the chances are you're going to stabilize around Zoe first. But if you get dropped these items, or it's like a Scuttle Puddle, or it's something where you know that you're going to make it to level 9 and you have a bunch of AD items, Ezreal's a great holder in your mid game that you can then move on to Jinx in your late game, which we'll talk about after. So the team, the units themselves, they work really well with each other to synergize and hold amongst themselves, and then be able to pivot and play pretty flexibly towards your late game in terms of who you itemize as your main carries. Now, let's talk about a general 7 rebel board. This is a typical 7 rebel board that I usually hit and I usually aim for if I'm playing rebel. So in this case, we're going to talk about it from top to bottom, but basically you just play 7 rebel. Here I just dropped one of the rebel units to put Jinx here. If you don't have Jinx, you're basically just playing Vex on your board in place of Jinx on level 8 until you find a Jinx, and then you could play the Jinx. The Jinx is the most important part of the rebel board, and a lot of times if you're trying to play for like a high placement, like a first or a second, you need to find a Jinx and you need to itemize towards the Jinx. The earlier the Jinx, the better. If you get anomalies on Jinx, it's absolutely massive. We'll talk a little bit about anomalies in a second, because, you know, just like passing by some ideas that work really well with rebels. But for now, I'll just remove the Vex, and we'll just imagine that we have the Jinx here with her AD items. So starting at the top, Alawi, you're not playing a vertical Sentinel board. You're not playing much more than 2 Sentinel typically with this board, because you can't fit it in with 7 Rebel unless you have a spatula. So without an emblem or a spatula, typically you just want Alawi to have like Giga tank items. She doesn't have deep Sentinel trait activated, so armor and MR is pretty good, especially if she's your main tank in the front line. But you're very flexible in terms of what Alawi items you can make, because she's going to have a bunch of HP because of the Rebel trait. Right, she's going to get the extra 15% max health. I think that's in addition to the 12%, but either way, I don't want to speak to it. And then you also have to, you can also build armor and MR, because she does have good scaling in terms of doing extra damage based on her armor and MR. So that works out really well as well. So here I just put Giga tank items, right? I put like Bramble, Declaw. You could put any tank items. I think most of them will work out pretty well. You can also put utility items on Alawi, but I would be careful about that sometimes, because if you're playing vertical rebel, you're really relying on Alawi to live as long as possible. She does live quite long because she scales off AP, which you get a bunch of from the rebel trait. So her AP scaling to like recover HP and kind of become like a Giga tank, and she gets that huge durability boost. It's totally great. With the addition of the rebel trait, and she also has a lot of time to like sustain herself, because you stall the fight out for 2 seconds with the stun, which works really nice. So you're typically fine with your front line. As a +1 unit, you know, 7 rebels, you play 7 of the rebel units, and then you can fit in 1 extra unit. Here I put Elise in. I think Elise is really nice to cap out the board later, because it gives you the opportunity to play Jace on level 9. Jace is really strong just as a general damage dealer. So having the Jace, you get the extra crystal, which can serve as a little bit more frontline for this team that you already have a lot of low cost units that don't do that much or don't contribute too much to your front line. Additionally, she gives you Bruiser, so you get to activate Sentinel, which gives your whole team a little bit of armor, and Bruiser, which gives your whole team a little bit of HP. So it basically makes your whole team collectively sustain itself a lot better. So Elise is a go-to unit a lot of the time, but there are many other options of +1 units that you can play, which I'll talk about after. Jace, more for late game, so I'll remove him from the board for now. Zoe's weird. Zoe is very, very, very weird in terms of the items that she wants. So because Rebels get so much attack speed, and Zoe's mana threshold, like when she has to cast, is quite high, a lot of people are actually likening Gwynsu on Zoe in lieu of a mana item a lot of the time. Sometimes you can put Gwynsu with a Shojin and just have her generate as much mana as possible, but this comp is very stall heavy. You're kind of relying on Alawi with a bunch of HP and a bunch of resistances to live as long as possible to get Zoe to cast as many times as possible. Zoe does this thing where she bounces a ball around and it hits a bunch of random units, and often it hits the backline units. I like to build her with like a full crit / damage amp build, basically what I want is the Zoe to cast and cheese the opponent a lot of the time. When you're playing around Zoe, you want her to hit the backline units and snipe them, and if she has full crit, like if you make her ability crit with a jewel gauntlet, you feel really comfortable that she just deletes some of the backline units. It synergizes with Jinx really well because the comp kind of stalls itself out. You have a lot of tankiness because it gives you HP, and then with the Sentinel and Bruiser in, you basically have your whole board kind of survives and sustains itself for long enough that Jinx can actually cast the rocket. If Jinx gets her rocket off, in combination with the Zoe that's also hitting a bunch of units and doing a bunch of spread damage, you basically have 2 units that are doing massive AoE and chunking away the opponent. It's devastating, and that's why you can usually win once you have the Jinx. Zoe on her own, if the opponent doesn't have upgraded units, she can snipe in the backline and be really stable and kind of get you into a really easy top 4 position because she's able to just bypass the front line and kill the enemy carries pretty often if you build her with like a lot of damage. If you combine that with Jinx, that's how late game, even if they have upgrades, it's devastating. A lot of times, the combination of a fully itemized Zoe 2 and a fully itemized Jinx 2, you basically just win the game on the spot. It's very strong. It's very devastating. Now, when we're talking about the board, a lot of times when I talk about Zoe, I don't say to build Guinsoo. Guinsoo's a little bit awkward. You could build it if you know for sure that you're playing around Rebels, but a lot of times I always talk about Zoe in the form of a fallback plan on other boards. For example, if you're trying to play around Silco or Heimerdinger. If you're trying to play around Silco or Heimerdinger, a lot of the times you're making general AP items early game, something like a Shojin Nashor's JG or a Shojin Nashor's +1 damage item. These are items that are really good on Silco, so if you end up playing around Silco's a little bit easier to stabilize, I think, because you don't have to rely on Alawi that's very contested, and you have a lot more frontline options. And Heimer, if you have an Alawi and you hit Heimerdinger, I think Heimerdinger is in general a safer play because the Academy board is a lot stronger and caps a lot higher. However, if you're playing around Zoe or forced to play around Zoe, it's a great fallback option. These items aren't perfect on Zoe because typically I think Guinsoo or even Adaptive Helm, I think I talk about it here. I'll mention it in a couple seconds. Adaptive Helm is really good on her. Shojin is probably one of the weaker items on her because Shojin Nashor's doesn't really do all that much. With the Rebel trait, you just want to stack more AP and more damage a lot of the time because it's not going to help her to cast that much faster because she already has a bunch of attack speed. But what's really good about this build is that in your mid game, it might not be the greatest thing to see on Zoe, but guess what? Late game transitions are a thing. So once you hit a Jinx, Jinx wants to fire the rocket ASAP. The faster you fire the rocket, the better off you will be because you just kill off most of the units and you can sway the fight instantly. So when you're playing around Jinx, you always want to have a mana item on Jinx. So late game, what people do is you build general AP items that you can work and play flexibly in your early and mid game. You can also stabilize around the Zoe because that's really important for your like mid to late game transitions. But as soon as you hit a Jinx, you can just whoop, take the Shojin and you can put it on Jinx. It's still usable. That's the thing that's really great about this. Even though Jinx isn't like a magic like caster unit, she does need to get her ult off and the mana does help her. So what you can do is you can late game transition to put that Shojin onto the Jinx, and that's why it's really popular to make these flexible AP items, because if you can play Heimer, you can play Heimer, you can play Silco, you can play Silco. If you hit Zoe, it's not the best on Zoe, but you can transition it onto Jinx for later in your game, and then you'll still cap your board very high. In the worst case scenario, you can just play it for a 4th or a 5th, and you can mitigate your LP losses, but that's the idea of Rebels often being a plan B. Zoe's pretty flexible in items. I think one of the weaker builds is like Shojin Nashor's JG, but it's one, like I said, that's very flexible and allows you to do that mana transition later in the game. Typically with Zoe, I think you want to make Guinsoo on her. That's the like better item, right? You can generate mana in 2 ways, right? You can have like something that actually gives you mana, or you can have something that boosts your attack speed so that you ramp up your attack speed. With the Rebel attack speed buff, she gets enough stacks on the Guinsoo that you get a lot of value off the extra attack speed. So typically you'll see something like Guinsoo and then like either a full crit or full damage amp. Additionally, because the comp stalls a lot and like, you know, with the attack speed and everything, Adaptive is pretty good. On Zoe, it gives her the mana over time, like every 3 seconds she gets 10 mana, which it's not that much better than like Shojin and the other builds. But the reason Adaptive is really good is because it also gives you some ability power and it's a good use of components. If you're planning on playing around Jinx especially, right? Like let's think about Jinx. Sometimes you don't even need to make the only reason I always recommend not making Adaptive Helm, by the way, early. because you cut out, like, you're using two components, a tier and a cloak, that are both good for magic resist shredding, which is basically like optimize your damage late game, right? You can use the cloak to make a spark or the tier to make a shiv. So it's a little bit riskier to play this way. However, if you're already planning on playing around Jinx, or let's say you already hit a Jinx, Jinx is going to be majority of the damage on your board always whenever you're playing Rebel. So if Jinx is majority of your damage and you're trying to itemize towards Jinx, this is a great use of components because it's quite good on Zoe. It's a really good item on her. It gives her AP mana, starting mana, gives her ability power. So what's it called? And it synergizes really well with the board, right? If you can, this is a time where you can sometimes make adaptations. If you're forced to play around Rebels and you already have a Jinx, you don't really care about making Shred, because you're going to make Sundering probably because you want the Jinx to do more damage. So you can often, in times like these, if you're stuck with it, you don't have a Shojin, or you have to make Adaptive Helm, it's actually quite a good item on Zoe. And then you can build like full damage amp, like I was saying. If you have a bunch of rods and stuff, right, like Rabadons, you can just make a Rabadons on her, because, like, Rabadons is risky because you're using two rods, right? Rods are really good for making AP items, so you don't necessarily want to use both rods to make a Rabadons. But because you know that you're going to be playing mostly as an AD unit later in the game, you can just go for like these crazy damage amps and full ability power builds like this, because it's quite good on Zoe because she can snipe the backline. And additionally, the components that you're using here aren't particularly high value components that you're going to try and put on Jinx later. So it works out really nicely. So you can actually play like these more risky styles, especially if you have like a Rebel emblem, or like or you're playing around a Rebel +1. And it's just something that I wanted to note and talk about, like, the importance of in this guide. Now, if we're talking about max cap boards, we're talking about like, this is the Giga Juicer, I'm gonna win the game type of beat. Something that works out really well is just playing these high value, like you play a bunch of 5 costs and you cap out your board really high. So before, we kind of talked about, like, with this board without an emblem, a lot of times you can play a Jace, and Jace does a lot of good work for you because it gives you like this extra dummy basically that helps out your front line, and then he also does an insane amount of damage. But what you can also do is play this board, which is pretty common that I see. Basically what you do is, with the Rebel +1, in your early game, you can usually play it around Elise and just have like an extra free spot on your board because the comp allows for many different types of units to be played. But late game, playing Echo for Ambusher is really nice because it basically gives Jinx the ability to crit on her ults as well as extra crit damage. So it basically helps boost the crit damage. You can also pair it with Rumble, because now that you have the Rebel emblem, you can actually still fit in 2 Sentinel. You can drop the Irelia, which is a very low cost unit that you're only playing for the Sentinel trait. Instead, you can play a Giga Juicer, really strong Sentinel like Rumble. And then you get Scrap in, so you get some extra conversion on some of your components, as well as the extra shielding that you get for both Echo and Rumble. So both these dudes act as like insanely strong tanks. And because you have Ambusher in, you can get the Jinx to do a massive amount of damage as well. So this is one of the more high cap versions that you can play around when you have a Rebel +1. I think if you look at the stats, like Rebel, like, I don't want to dwell too much on stats because obviously, like, it might be very misleading for beginner players that are less accustomed. But just if you're trying to optimize the board, I think Echo is one of the better holders of Rebel emblem for this reason, because a lot of times he makes great use of the stats. He's really good at the front line, and additionally, it gives you the Ambusher for the crit to do massive damage for Jinx. Additionally, one thing I want to note, so here I just put 7 Rebel units on the side. So this is just like, the typical 7 Rebel units. Originally I showed you this board where I said I usually play around Elise because it gives you Bruiser, and then you can cap out later around Jace for Form Swapper. But you should also note that pretty much there's basically like an open spot, right? When you're playing 7 Rebel, you basically have a free 2 Sentinel in, and you have your 7 Rebel activated. Sorcerer isn't that important on Zoe, because Sorcerer, especially only 2 Sorcerer, it doesn't give you that much, right? It gives your whole team 10 ability power, which your whole team gets a bunch of ability power, and then it gives an extra 20 to Zoe. You get so much from Rebel anyways that it's much better to just play towards Rebel than it is to play around Sorcerer. A lot of times, like, even vertical Sorcerer isn't that strong because it just lacks frontline. So unless you really need to, Zoe is more of a Rebel unit than a Sorc unit. You don't want to usually play around Sorcerer because it doesn't do that much. But I digress. What I was going to say is that With these 7 rebels on level 8, you could basically fit in anybody, right? You can play Mbessa or Garen to get emissary bonuses. Mbessa can also work as a carry for some AD items, because if you just hit a random Mbessa, you get quick striker in, the Mbessa will actually do some work. We already talked about Elise giving bruiser, which is really fun. Echo can give ambusher even without the spatula. Playing, if you have an early Jinx, you can just play an upgraded Echo, and nobody buys Echo, so it's totally fine, and you can just play around Echo for most of your game. A random Jace early on is also good because he just does a bunch of damage. And additionally, the addition of 6 cost. 6 cost can fit in really nicely with the rebel board because you don't have to lose any synergy, right? If you drop everybody here, you can just, if you find a random 6 cost, you just play this board, right? 7 rebel, Zoe's doing enough damage. Jinx will do enough damage with 7 rebel. Is not as optimized, but you can just play like a random 6 cost very easily with this board. That's what I mean by it's quite easy to stabilize a lot of the time. You're not like pigeonholed or forced to play a certain set of units. You basically have a free spot, right? 7 rebel, you've put the 7 in, and then whoever you hit on your roll down that you can find that helps synergize. You can obviously have preferences for which one you like, but at least on level 8, if you roll really deep, you can find something to put on the board that will help you out really nicely, and then allow you to more easily transition into that level 9 situation where you can hit the legendaries to make your board a lot stronger. In terms of the 6 costs, Victor is probably the best 6 cost you can hit with this board. It's absolutely broken because Victor does a huge stun as well, where he does like a 2-second stun. That's his whole thing that kind of sways the fight. If you combine that with the Rebel stun, basically you have the stun from Rebel, then as soon as the stun from Rebel's over, Victor casts, and then you have another stun. You basically like remove the opponent's units from being able to do anything for like majority of the fight. It's insane, especially late game. So Rebel with Victor is a huge win condition, and it really, like, I can't stress it enough. If you can find a Victor, always find a, like, especially with Rebel, like, of course you should always find a way to play Victor because he's just broken, but especially with Rebel, if you see a Victor, there is no way you don't play Victor. It's like you always play Victor. I remember I was playing one guy one time, and he took out Victor while I was fighting him, and he was Rebel, and then he lost the fight, and I was like, I don't know what's going on. That happened on stream one time, and it's like, okay, sure, but I just want to make it clear in case it's like, I know it sounds obvious, but I've seen people troll sometimes and not do this. You always play Victor. Additionally, the other units are also quite good, so of course you have that flexibility because with 7 Rebel, the last unit isn't that important, so it's just whatever synergy you can find. Additionally, let's talk about flex options with Rebel. So I say Rebel a lot of time is like a nice plan B option. I don't like to say that all the time. Like, you know, I don't want people to like, you know, hate a trait for no reason. But Rebel does share a lot of inter-team synergies with the Heimer line, right? When you're playing around Heimerdinger, you typically want to play around a front line of Sentinels and a back line of Academy units. Basically, 2 of the units here, Irelia and Alawi, are Sentinels, which are usually played on the Heimer board, and Ezreal is an Academy and a Rebel unit. So these 3 units can easily be used to play around Heimerdinger, or they can be used to play around Rebels. So a lot of times, if you're rolling down looking for a Heimer board, you hold on to Zoe's, and if you hit like an early Jinx, for example, like let's say you're doing your roll down and you're thinking, I'm going to play around Heimer this game, and you hit a Jinx randomly. Where's Jinx? You hit a random Jinx. You're like, yeah, nah, I can just play Rebel from here. It's a really good pivot option. I think Academy is easier to play and caps higher, but it's significantly more contested. A lot of times you can hit Zoe for free. It's absolutely absurd how easy this unit is to hit because she's just like there's not many boards that are playing her, especially when there's AP lines. Of course, sometimes you find a spot where multiple people are playing towards Rebel because they hit some of those really good Rebel augments that I was talking about, or they hit a Rebel emblem, but aside from those type of lobbies, typically it's one of the less played comps, and it's a little bit more underplayed, so it's a lot more of a safer bet to angle yourself that way. Of course, on your roll down, if you hit Alawi 2-star and you hit Heimer 2, and then you hit a Jinx, it's like, I'm not saying sell the Heimer and play Jinx. What I'm saying is keep your options open. Whichever one you hit, you can just pivot because the units that you're holding, like these 3 units, they work with both boards, so it's easier at least to pivot between the 2 lines. And we talked about pivoting before with like the items and why like I usually make Shojin Dashers even if I'm angling Rebel. So you got a little bit of an idea of how my brain's working on that one. Early game boards now. So early game, you have a lot of different options. So typically whenever you have like an early AP board, you can angle yourself towards Rebel. Like I say, whenever you're playing around AP, you should always keep your lines open because the AP lines feel very synergetic, or they can mesh into each other pretty easily. So for example, if you start with an early Vex and Morgana, this is a situation where you might want to play around the Morgana later and play towards Silco because of Black Rose Silco Dominators being very strong. But you can also itemize and play around the Vex in your early and mid game. It's very easy to just play around Sentinels as well. All 1-cost units, by the way. This is a very typical AP opener that you would have. 2 Visionary, 2 Sentinel. You can even have more Visionary if you have something like a Rel that's also a Sentinel that you can play around. But additionally, as you transition into your mid-game board, you can easily take this and transition as both a AP, like, you know, let me find this, like, maybe I'll show it after, but like, let's just say you find like a Rebel unit, right? 3 Rebel gives max HP to all of your Rebel units, so it does make your board tankier. So you can just play a random set, and then you get 3 Rebel active, which gives your Vex some attack speed, your Vex some AP and AD, and 3 Rebel, it gives like a little bit of HP to everybody, which is great. Additionally, if you have a different backline like Sorcerers, you can play around Lux in your early mid game. You can also play a Bruiser frontline if you have an early set. So it's really flexible and you can just fit in some of these Rebel units. Additionally, if you're playing a board like this, sometimes you can also play around Academy for your early game. It doesn't mean you have to commit to Academy, but you can leave that option open because it's very easy to just play around, for example, something like this. 3 Academy, 3 Rebel. You could just put in some Rebel units. Maybe you don't have Sword because Sword Kit doesn't matter that much, but you'll have something like this. You have 3 Academy, 3 Rebel, and 2 Sentinel, and then you can play like an extra Bruiser, or you can just go for full Sentinel in the front line, but it gives you some good options. And then you can also use Ezreal as like a carry for AD items if it's one of those high item galaxies that you have like an absolute metric crap ton of items. You can do something like this. Additionally, I said that Zoe's really good with Guinsoo, so if you start the game off with some sort of Guinsoo build, like something like a Zeri or a Maddie Sniper build, sometimes you can use these type of openers to transition into Rebels because Zoe is a great Guinsoo user. Zoe's also a good user for the same reason of something like Gambler's Blade, I believe. So like, you know, sometimes you have these openers where you take something that has a bunch of attack speed and then you want to transition into something else. Additionally, like, you know, this board works really well with like a Kog'Maw line, for example. And if you're a contester, you end up that you don't think you can play around Kog'Maw. Sometimes openers like this where you have Guinsoo, attack speed, or like Gambler's Blade, you can then transition those onto a Zoe later in the game, which helps you out a lot in terms of giving you an option, especially if you have something like, you know, attack speed and AP, for example. So like, let's say you hit like, you know, you're trying to play around Kog'Maw and you have like this and a JG because like you don't have perfect Kog'Maw items. You have an option of taking these type of boards and transitioning them over to a Zoe board because of the Guinsoo that works really well on her. Alright, so what are your conditions for success? Let's wrap it up. Make this one a nice little video for everybody on New Year's Day. So what do we got? AP, your Sentinel openers and items, these are all pretty good. Additionally, I didn't mention it before, I'll mention it right now. The reason I say Sentinel opener is because let's say you have an emblem. A lot of times, like let's say for instead of Rebel emblem, you have something like a Sentinel emblem. Let me just put it in Irelia, right? Sometimes even with a Sentinel emblem, you can cap out your board pretty high around playing, I'm trying to find it, around playing like 4 Sentinel as well. Something like, where's Rumble and Echo and Sentinel. You can also play boards like this pretty easily, where you can play like 4 Sentinel with like a similar setup. So a Sentinel emblem gives you a little bit of an out, even a Bruiser emblem sometimes, because you can just activate it with set. These are options that you can look for. Like I said, if you're a contestant, you don't hit Heimer, you don't just like FF and go next, you know, you still have options to play around. Like I said, these boards aren't stronger than some of the strongest boards that are out there, but they are quite reliable in terms of mitigating losses or making sure that you get like a relatively uncontested top 4. Whenever you play around Rebels, you typically want to be uncontested. This isn't a line that's particularly strong, so if you're playing a not very strong line and you're being contested while playing it, that's pretty bad. Often you play this when other AP lines are very contested, or if you're in a galaxy, like I said, where you can easily make it to a Jinx, or if you find a Jinx via augment, right? There's a lot of augments that give you a Jinx, or if you're just playing around like Rebels, like in general, because you have a Rebel emblem early, or a really good spot for it. but you don't want to be contested on it typically. You want to be as far away from everybody else as possible. Often, like, you play this line if you already hit the Alawi and then you can't find the Heimer, you can buy Zoe's and then stabilize around Zoe and then decide what to do later in the game. So it's really good if you find an early Alawi and you don't think that you have a good spot for Academy or any of those other higher capping boards. Typically, you want to play this with high econ as well because you want to be able to find a Jinx eventually. It's not critical, like it's not like you're guaranteed going 8th if you don't find Jinx, but obviously Jinx is going to synergize super great and she's going to be your condition to go like 1/2. Without a Jinx, you're probably going to cap out around like, I don't know, like 4th, 3rd maybe if you're lucky, but like you're not going to cap very high. So you really want to make it to Jinx. That's like the really important things. It's not like it's not like, you know, you need Jinx to the point where you can't play Rebel unless you have a Jinx. But it's to a point where it's like, you know, if you want to have like better success than just average, you need a Jinx. So you want to have high econ. You want to be able to itemize multiple carries, right? Both your Zoe and your Jinx. And then you want to eventually have good econ, make it to level 9, cap out your board around legendary units. So that's it for this guide. Next up, I think of this series will be Scrap. I am working in the background on making a general rank up series. So that's going to be like one where I talk about, hey, what should you do at each rank as like general tips. And then one of them is going to be like, hey, these are some reliable comps to play. If you've been watching most of my content, then you already kind of get a feel for when I describe, hey, this comp's reliable or this comp's a sometimes food. So you can obviously take those to extrapolate what those videos are going to be. But those general guides are also coming. If you do like my content, like I said before, please make sure to like and subscribe. And if you're looking forward to that type of content, please make sure to check it out. The next in this series is Scrap. So I think I said that twice. Or I don't know. My brain's, it's New Year's. So, you know, like everything's a mess for me. But, Scrap is going to be next because of request. If you have one that you want to hear about, like one of the traits or one of the type of boards, please make sure to mention it in the comments below, and then I'll add it to the list as the next up in the series, basically. Thank you for watching and have a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye-bye.